Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad to have you here. We have a full house today. I'm delighted to be here today representing the board of the directors of the Public Policy Institute of California. And we are delighted today to present a program featuring Speaker of the Assembly, John Pérez. My name is Donna Lucas, if I didn't say that. This event is part of PPIC's 2013 Speaker Series on California's future. I'd like to thank our sponsors because without them we wouldn't be able to have all of you for lunch and be able to present such a great program. They are Applied Materials Foundation, the California Endowment, the James Irvine Foundation, Nicholas Berggruen Institute on Governance, Pacific Life Foundation, the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, Sierra Health Foundation, Southern California Edison, Stewart Foundation, Union Bank, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and our knowledge partner, who is McKinsey & Company. The series is also made available through the PPIC Donors Circle, which all of you are invited to participate at any time. We'd love to have you. Before we begin, let me ask for two housekeeping items. One, if you can turn off your cell phones, that would be terrific. Second of all, on your tables, there's a survey. As you know, PPIC, we're always interested in getting everyone's opinion and doing surveys. So if you could fill that out, it's confidential, but it really helps us to really gauge how the event is and also for planning for future events. Now, we are going to move on to the program, and I am delighted to represent one of our amazing, talented researchers, Dean Bonner, who will briefly discuss some key findings from the new PPIC statewide survey, which was released today. So if you all read Rough and Tumble, you saw it was the top story. After Dean's remarks, the speaker will be joined by PPIC's president and CEO, Mark Baldassare, for a conversation about a variety of issues facing California, including governing in this era of Democratic supermajority. So now I'm pleased to introduce Dean to come on up and talk to us. Thank you.
So before I start, I would like to echo what Donna said about the survey. As a surveyor, I really encourage you to fill out the survey because we appreciate having your input. So today I will be presenting the key findings of our most recent statewide survey, which was supported with generous funding from the James Irvine Foundation. Our interviews took place from March 5th to March 12th, and we interviewed 1,700 Californians, including just over 1,000 likely voters. So in PPIC surveys in the wake of the Great Recession, likely voters have been pessimistic about the economic outlook of the state. However, in recent months, we have seen increasing optimism with expectations of good times reaching levels not seen since 2007. We also find that likely voters continue to hold pessimistic views about the state budget situation, and at least 7 in 10 likely voters have called the budget a big problem since January 2008. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. Today, nearly all likely voters say the state budget situation is at least somewhat of a problem, including more than 6 in 10 across parties and regions who call it a big problem. In this survey, we asked about 3 potential new revenue sources to address the state budget situation. There is majority support among likely voters for increasing taxes on alcoholic beverages. However, support falls short of a majority on extending the sales tax to services, even if the overall sales tax rate was lowered, or taxing the extraction of oil and natural gas. There is bipartisan support for the tax on alcohol, but there is a partisan divide on the other 2 tax proposals. And when it comes to fiscal reforms, likely voters are reluctant to lower the vote threshold for the legislature to pass taxes on their own, but 6 in 10 think it's a good idea for the legislature to be able to put tax measures on the ballot for voter approval with a simple majority vote. We also find that likely voters are divided about lowering the vote threshold to 55% for voters to pass local sales taxes for transportation projects. And on each of these reforms, Democrats express more support than Republicans. As some in Sacramento seek to reform the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, we find that likely voters are divided over the cost of stricter environmental laws and regulations in California, with about half saying they cost too many jobs and hurt the economy, and just under half saying they're worth the cost. As one might expect, there are differences across parties, and across regions. Likely voters in the Central Valley say these regulations hurt the economy, while those in the San Francisco Bay Area say they're worth the cost. And we find that likely voters elsewhere in the state are more divided. And when read a summary of the 2009 water package, which includes an $11.1 billion bond slated to be on the November 2014 ballot, half of likely voters say they would vote no on the bond, while 4 in 10 would vote yes. This marks a drop in support from last March, when we found that 51% of likely voters would vote yes. Partisan differences are present, and support falls short of a majority across regions. When we asked those who say they would plan to vote no on the bond how they would vote if the bond were a smaller amount, overall support increases to 61%. And with the California High-Speed Rail Authority set to begin the sale of voter-approved bonds, and with construction of the system set to begin later this year, we find 54% of likely voters are opposed to building a high-speed rail system in California, while 4 in 10 are in favor. Findings on this issue were similar last year. And when those who plan to vote no are asked how they would feel about the cost how they would feel about the system if the costs were less, overall support once again increases, this time to 55%. So in conclusion, we find that concern about California's current economic and budget situation is affecting attitudes towards the state's plans for the future, with likely voters more likely to oppose than favor the state water bond and high-speed rail system. They are also not inclined to make it easier for the legislature to pass taxes on its own, but are much more positive about lowering the vote threshold for the legislature to put measures on the ballot, tax measures on the ballot. And at this time, we'll just take a few minutes to move the podium out the way and set the stage. So just have one moment. Oops, sorry.
No? Stay?
Yes.
We're waiting for the speaker, and so, Dean, you don't get away so easy on this. If there are any questions from the audience, I'm Mark Baldassare, by the way, president of PPIC and CEO, and here is the speaker. So
You'll have to save that question for later.
Save that thought for later, or look for him later on. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, the speaker has joined us today. He's not feeling too well, so one thing that I brought were cough drops.
Thank you.
So.
Am I mic'd up okay for everybody?
Yeah. Let me say a few words of introduction for the speaker while we're getting going here. Have just a short introduction. Very distinguished career. Speaker was elected to the Assembly in November 2008, and January 2010, his colleagues elected him as California's 68th Assembly Speaker, an event which marked the first time in American history an openly LGBT person was elected to such a position. Throughout his time in office, the Speaker has made job creation and recovering California's economy the top priority of the Assembly. Under his leadership, the Assembly has passed legislation to support emerging industries like green energy and manufacturing. He authored the Middle Class Scholarship Act, which sought to reduce student fees at the UC and CSU by 2/3 for middle-class students. He also worked to secure passage of the Homeowners' Bill of Rights, pension reform, and workers' compensation reform, in the last legislative session. Prior to his election to the Assembly, the Speaker was a longtime member of the labor movement. He also served on numerous local, state, federal, and nonprofit boards and commissions. He was appointed by President Bill Clinton to serve on the President's Commission on HIV/AIDS and continued to serve under President George W. Bush. He's a longtime member of the Democratic National Committee, and in August 2012, he was elected President of the National Speakers Conference. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And you and I...
Just apologize up ahead. My energy level is really low. I've got a horrible sinus infection that only afflicts me when I'm in Sacramento.
Well, having observed the Speaker during your tenure, I can only imagine that you in low energy are a lot higher energy than most people are on any given day. So it's a pleasure to have you here. And one thing that I wanted to mention first off is that we met when you had first become Speaker. It was certainly a different session, different makeup of the legislature then. And at PPIC, we've observed and have tried the change in the legislature. You've got a supermajority. You've got members, record number of new members, not just in your delegation, but overall in the Assembly. And you have new members who are coming in, 38 of them in the Assembly, who are eligible to serve for up to 12 years because of Prop 28 passing. And so I would like you to first reflect on what policy making is like in this new legislative session and how it's different from what you might have experienced early in your tenure.
You've got a lot of things packaged in there, so let's kind of unpackage several of them. So one issue in there is the fact that we've got a supermajority, and today we do. We lost one member today to go to the Senate to fill one of the vacancies in the special election there. So the Senate is back up to supermajority status today. We still are at supermajority status. We will soon lose our supermajority status because another member of the Assembly will soon go over to the Senate, and then we have a couple more leaving, one to join the LA City Council in July, and another who will likely run for the Senate later on throughout the year. And so what you've seen is, from election night forward, I've always said that the supermajority status wasn't a major fundamental difference in the way that we'd operate, because I understood then, as I do now, that there was never going to be a time during this first year of this two-year session where both houses had a practical supermajority at the same time. And in fact, we won't. This is early enough in the session that it's not the time that you would make any of the uses of a supermajority that people think of. Second, what are the kinds of things you can use a supermajority for? Clearly, taxes are one. Constitutional amendments and putting things on the ballot are the second. So let's deal with the one that scares people, taxes. The governor, since his campaign for governor, made it very clear that he would not sign any taxes into law that weren't voted on directly by the people. We've seen him be true to his word. There were opportunities to pass them in his first year as governor. We had the votes, even without the supermajority, to do some of that in the Assembly. He wasn't interested in doing that. He's no more interested today than he was then. I don't believe in engaging in futile efforts, so we're not going to be looking at doing broad-based taxes that are never going to change the law in the state. And then with respect to constitutional amendments and putting things before the voters, that's something that we have to be very cautious about. And we should only do those types of things where we can really build broad-based consensus. And so what I think you'll notice is, in my time as Speaker, I've worked very hard to find a couple of Republican votes on all major issues. And in each year that I've been Speaker, I've been able to produce Republican votes for controversial issues, even when the other house couldn't do so. Twice to close the single sales factor loophole, even as recently as 2 weeks ago in passing our expansion of Medi-Cal. Got a Republican vote on that, even though in the Senate passed on a simple majority basis. So what that means is, even though the composition on a partisan basis change, the imperative doesn't. You have to create space for everybody to engage in legislating. The other thing I think you're going to see is very different sets of realities between the two houses because of the impacts of term limits. 75% of the senators will have seen their last election by next year.
Wow.
75% of the senators will have seen their last election by next year, whereas the majority of assembly members can be here for 12 years. So it's 38 out of the 80. It's 28 out of my 55 Democrats, so it's the majority of the supermajority, and both of those numbers will grow by 3. So it'll be 41 or 42 of the 80, 31 or 32 of the 55 Democrats. And so what that means is that nobody knows where the political center of gravity is on the majority of issues for the caucus. And so when you see me not making broad-based pronouncements, it's not because I don't enjoy coming up with crazy ideas and telling everybody about them as much as the next guy, but because we're still trying to get everybody to the same set of data.
Yeah.
And then figure out where the center of gravity is and where you can push the envelope to get people to do what's necessary in the interest of the state. So I think what you're going to see is, in conflict with what has historically been the case, the Assembly will be the cooling saucer as opposed to the Senate.
Interesting.
And as this shift in term limits takes effect over the next 4 years, you're going to see an increased power center in the Assembly compared to the Senate, because you won't have Assembly members anymore looking to move to the Senate in the way that you currently do.
So I've met now 35 of the 39 new legislators who were eligible for 12 years, who came in under the top 2 primary and the independent districts. Do you have any sweeping generalizations about this group? I mean, as you meet them and work with them on a daily basis?
Yes, but I don't know what to attribute it to. One, I think that this group is looking to be a little more deliberative in some of their approaches and doesn't feel like it's rushing. I think part of that is because of 12 years as opposed to a maximum of 6. But I think the other thing is that unlike my class or the class between us in the Assembly, they're not coming in and having to solve a multi-billion-dollar deficit. When I got sworn in December of 8, we had a $60 billion deficit out of a $110 billion budget. These folks got sworn in, and the good news is we're broke. Right. And broke is a lot better than where we've been.
Yeah. And let's talk about that change in the fiscal health. We've had a number of programs, early in the year over the last decade, and generally the theme is the deficit and how to deal with it. And it looks like we don't have a deficit. Looks like there may be some maybe even additional revenues that come in before the May revise. And how does somebody in your position, where we've had these years of cuts to social services that have been very painful to folks who are part of your Democratic constituency, you've got that to deal with. You've got folks who are saying, there's so many types of new investments that we ought to be making, modernizing our state, and now's the time to do it. And then you have the governor who's saying, well, we've got to pay down the debt. We have to be responsible about this. How do you think about balancing these different forces, and where do you come down on this?
Well, let's start with the basics. You can't engage in that which you can't fund. So what do we know? We know that in rough terms, our revenues are about $5 billion above what had previously been projected. But we also know that the short-term taxes bring in $7 billion. So the money in excess is still less than the $7 billion. So it's short-term money. It's not one-time money, but it's short-term money. Until you're north of that $7 billion number, where your funding in excess of projection is greater than the amount of short-term revenues that are going to expire in a finite period of time, then you have to treat that money as either one-time money or short-term money, which means that you can't use it for ongoing annual obligations. Everybody talks about business needing predictability. The state needs predictability as well. So you can't engage in this process where, as you have spikes, you spend the entirety of the spike. You have to be responsible and use that money for one-time or short-term purposes. So appropriate things would be things like paying down the debt or making infrastructure investments that are one-time but have an ongoing benefit. So that's that. The second is you have to ask how much of that $5 billion is real. And we have reason to believe that a large proportion of that $5 billion isn't real. It's people who front-loaded their taxes based on the national tax discussion that was going forward. So we have to weigh the revenue in that way as well. We have to continue to be as responsible as we've been over the last couple of years. If you look, when I first ran for the Assembly, and it used to make my campaign consultants go crazy, in every campaign speech and at every editorial board, I talked about needing to change some of our basic governance principles. And one of the ones I talked about was needing to get back to simple majority to pass a budget. They thought I was crazy, that I would make everybody's eyes glaze over and that it would never happen. Thankfully, there was an initiative, the voters approved it, simple majority to pass a budget. What happens the next year? We pass a budget on time, and we increase the credit rating of the state by every major federal credit reporting agency. Second year, we pass another budget on time, again improve the credit rating. In that first year, we eliminated in rough terms 2/3 of the structural deficit of the state. In the second term, we eliminated the balance of the structural deficit predicated on the short-term taxes being passed, but identifying the things that we would do if they didn't. The voters evaluated and voted to approve the short-term taxes, and now, as I said, we're flat broke. But we've had now successive on-time budgets and successive increases in our bond rating, which means that we need to do more of the same. Now, this is in contrast to what was happening in Washington, D.C., where we've seen the creditworthiness of the federal government get downgraded once, and where we've seen us go from cycle to cycle in these fiscal crises that we're currently in with sequestration. So it reinforces for us absolute fiscal discipline. Now, what about values? Every decision we make has to be rooted in what our values are in governing. And so when you saw my first budget negotiations with Governor Schwarzenegger, he proposed a budget that would have eliminated hundreds of thousands of jobs. We fought him. I created a counter proposal, for lack of a better term. We called it the California Jobs Budget, and it was all predicated on protecting those jobs. And we protected all but 20,000 of the, I forget if it was 320 or 420,000 jobs that were in jeopardy, but we saved hundreds of thousands of jobs that were in jeopardy, 90% of them. And the reason we did that was, one, it was consistent with our values, and two, we understood that California's economy is disproportionately consumer-driven. And if you move massive numbers of additional people into unemployment, there's a downward spiral. So as we move forward, we have to be mindful of the values discussions and of what the impact our budgetary decisions are and what impact they have on the broad-based economy of the state.
I wonder, if a big part of our budget is health and human services. We just had a special session. Your legislation on Medi-Cal expansion passed. It's an important component of the federal ACA implementation, healthcare reform that is set to take effect in 2014. I wonder if you can explain to us, the significance of the legislation that just passed, how it fits into the federal healthcare reform that we're about to be implemented in California.
So again, forgive me, I'm a little cloudy on numbers today. In rough terms, we've got as many as 6 million uninsured people in the state. The first thing we did to move forward on healthcare reform was creating the health benefit exchange. And I wrote the legislation a couple of years ago. We were the first state in the country to create the exchange. Our exchange is well underway, and we believe a couple of million people will be able to avail themselves of healthcare through the exchange, individuals, small businesses, and the like. So that's a piece. The second piece is the Affordable Care Act allowed for expansion of Medicaid, health for the indigent. And one of the groups of people that had been significantly uninsured were single adults that were just above the poverty level. And so the federal legislation allowed us to go up to 138% of the poverty level, which for a single individual is $15,400 a year. So it allows us now to capture people up to $15,400 a year.
How many people are involved in
Roughly between 1 million and 1.2 million people in California that are eligible. Single individuals without children living on $15,400 a year or less. And just think about, what that means and what it costs to buy health insurance. And what they've allowed for is for this program to be 100% federally funded for the first 3 years. And then at the end of those first 3 years, 90% of it to be federally funded. So there's a step down from 100% federal funding to 90% federal funding. You contrast that with the main group of folks currently under Medicaid, where there's a 50-50 match. And this is a marked improvement in terms of federal match to capture this. It'll bring billions of dollars of economic activity into the state, and it'll move people from being uninsured to insured, which will decrease some of the pressures on those of us who are already insured and who are paying part of our premium literally to cover the cost of uninsured individuals who end up in emergency rooms or other places. There's also an element of the Affordable Care Act that streamlines eligibility for people who are currently eligible. So people who meet all the tests, but who have had impediments in availing themselves. So instead of qualifying 4 times a year, you qualify twice a year. Instead of having to re-qualify based on certain changes in living circumstances, you don't have to do that. So some basic streamlining that cuts the administrative costs and increases the amount of money that's available for direct health care delivery. Those two things in combination with each other should pick up to another 2 million people. So we could, between the health benefit exchange, changes in eligibility for changes in processing for currently eligible, and expansion for this new group of people up to 138% of the poverty level, we can pick up 2/3 of the uninsured population in the state of California, which would be monumental.
And the governor has a different point of view on this?
The governor has a different point of view on how you administer certain parts of it.
I see.
So one question is, should it be a single state-run operation, or should it be 58 individual county operations? And so there's a lot of discussion. I favor a single state-run operation so you could get maximized streamlining. The governor would prefer a county operation, and there are implications in terms of money for the counties in doing that, and clearly the counties are reticent because of their experience with realignment and what their concern is, whether money is appropriately flowed to them and whether it creates unnecessary exposure for them. 2 counties, Ventura and Santa Clara, have asked for a hybrid where the rest of the state be under a statewide program and they be able to operate their own kind of programs. The governor's been very clear that he doesn't want to have a hybrid. It's either one plan for the whole state or 58 plans for each of the counties. I actually think when you look at patterns of utilization and patterns of access to health care, especially in rural parts of the state, there is a strong argument to be made for a statewide approach, and I think there's arguments to be made in terms of economies of scale. When you look at the traditional health insurance market, we don't have 58 markets. We do have regional pricing schemes, so that a Bay Area plan may look different than a Central Valley plan, and may look different than an LA regional plan, but it's still one centralized system with appropriate zones under it to make sure that pricing is appropriate. And we're going to go through a very deliberative process with members of the legislature and with the governor, and I think we're going to get to a good outcome together.
Very exciting and important policy change.
Important, I don't know how exciting.
Well, exciting to us us policy wonks. So the place where the state spends the most money is K through 12. And the other big policy discussion this year is around local control, as it's being called, which is really about school finance and how we allocate funds, particularly to English learner schools, districts with high proportions of English learners and low-income students. Where is that debate and discussion going today?
If you're asking me what the outcome is going to be, I can tell you I honestly don't know. If you ask me what the process is, I'll tell you. We're going to have part of this in our budget subcommittees and our budget committee, and part of it in our policy committee, because it really is both questions at once. To the extent that it drives allocation, it's appropriately before our budget committee, but to the extent that it changes policies, it's got to be in our policy committees. So much of this is about relieving the requirements of certain categorical programs for school districts that want greater flexibility. And during the worst part of the economic crisis, we basically waived entitlement obligations. But the experience has been very inconsistent around the state. You take one of the more controversial elements, which is adult education. In the majority of the state, people just walked away from their adult education obligation altogether. In some places, they walked away from some of their obligations around other categorical programs. And that means that all of the legislators and all of the civic organizations who've been engaged in the discussions around those entitlement programs are appropriately skeptical of what it would mean to eliminate the mandates in the future. So I do not think this is going to be an easy conversation by any means. If you argue in broad terms, as the governor does, that the funding should follow the degree of need in different communities, that seems to make sense. But that was the notion around many of the entitlement programs before. And in some cases, what we saw were perverse incentives, where people were incentivized to have certain kinds of negative outcomes because the money followed the negative outcome. We don't want to do that. We want to incentivize positive outcomes in terms of educational attainment of our kids. And we also are really concerned about what message it sends to the voters. When we went to the voters and asked them to approve Prop 30, to approve the short-term taxes, we talked about the ability to fund education adequately. And so under the governor's proposal, there are places that would actually see a decrease in funding even after passing Prop 30 because of his realignment proposal for local control. And I don't know that that would be well received if people understood that they voted to pass this tax to support education and the net impact in their community was a reduction. I also don't know that it's good policy. And so the question ought to be, what are the adequate funding levels for schools in different parts of the state, and how do we get there? We're still lagging behind the majority of states around the country in per pupil funding. We're in a great position compared to where we've been the last 4 years, but not compared to where most people think we should be in adequately funding education. And so we really ought to be having an outcomes discussion and then saying, what does it take to get to the outcomes that we want?
So are you saying we're not in the place that we have adequate funding for our system right
Correct.
now? Let's talk about higher ed, because you're a UC regent and
And a CSU trustee.
And a CSU trustee, and you've spoken very passionately about college affordability issues, and you followed that up with your work in the legislature. What can our state do to make college more affordable for more Californians? And how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah. Well, look, I will humbly say I had a perfect solution last year. No, but think about it. We created a tax benefit to out-of-state corporations inadvertently in a budget a few years ago. It benefited out-of-state corporations to the tune of roughly $1.2 billion. The LAO identified it as a problem. Both houses of the legislature identified it as a problem. And the governor identified it as a problem. Everybody came up with solutions. We passed the first solution in the Assembly by a bipartisan basis. Sent it over to the Senate, had it die. Last year we came back, we looked at addressing the same problem, and then said, okay, the $1.2 billion would allow us to reduce fees at UC and CSU by 2/3 and move hundreds of millions of dollars to community colleges also to deal with affordability. It would have been the biggest investment in middle class affordability we could have had. And that's what a crisis is. The crisis is for middle class kids. The poorest kids still get covered through our Pell Grant system and our Cal Grant system. And the most affluent families are able to absorb the cost because it's still cheaper, barely, to go to UC or CSU than to go to privates. But for the middle class that wasn't eligible for financial aid, they were increasingly getting squeezed. And we actually got to a point where nationally, student loan debt is greater than consumer credit card debt. Greater than consumer credit card debt. And unlike consumer credit card debt, you can never walk away from it. And so it's not just an impact in terms of debt, it is driving certain students to go out of state that we should be keeping here, particularly problematic for African American students. We don't have affirmative action to draw them in, and out-of-state schools were recruiting them and funding them at a higher level than we were. And once a student receives a degree from another place, they're more likely to stay there than come home. And so we were basically incentivizing a brain drain in certain parts of our state, which makes no sense whatsoever. But so for us to drive middle-class students into making decisions to go elsewhere is really bad for the state. And when a student was graduating with huge amounts of debt, it changed their life choices in terms of what career paths they could take. And that is very negative for the state as well. So that was the problem. We figured out a solution. It failed because some of the out-of-state corporations wanted to keep the benefit that they had. There was an alternative solution that was on the ballot, an initiative to close the same loophole and then send the money to energy efficiency. When you put the question before the voters of do you think that out-of-state corporations ought to pay the same taxes as in-state corporations, the answer is pretty simple. The voters got it. I'm not a big fan of the initiative process, but they tend to make good decisions most of the time. And so we closed the loophole, but we got something that was less beneficial for the state. Energy efficiency is great, but it doesn't make the same monumental impact on the economy or the operations of the state as college affordability does. So half of the money is pre-designated for energy efficiency. The other half is up for grabs. And I think that amongst the many things that we ought to talk about using that for is still college affordability for middle-class families. And so the money's there.
So that would be about $600 million?
That'd be about $600 million. So that ought to be one of the things that we consider. I'm sure my colleagues in both houses have other ideas of how to use that money.
Yeah.
But when you look at the long-term impact of college affordability on our economy, it's huge. When you ask corporations what keeps them in California, one of the most consistent answers you hear is a well-trained, well-educated workforce. We cannot continue to walk away from our investment in the best public university system in the world.
Thank you. Let's talk about a couple of federal issues that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. First of all, immigration policy reform. And what should the shape and form of immigration policy reform look like to be beneficial to California?
Well, most people get frustrated when we talk about things that we have no actual say in. So
we don't have any actual say here.
Right. So we
maybe somebody's listening.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it.
So let's talk about what the legislature said. We have passed a resolution on a bipartisan basis calling for comprehensive immigration reform. And so when you look at the broad-based tenets of the president's proposal, there was a significant overlap between the president's proposal and what we said coming out of the state legislature. We know that there's an absolute need for ongoing access to an immigrant workforce for many industries in the state, so we've got to be honest about those ideas. We know that in rough terms there are 12 million undocumented people in the country, and we believe that there ought to be a pathway for stabilizing their presence and a long-term pathway to citizenship. You can get into all the discussions about what the intermediate steps are, but there's got to be that. But we also know more than any other state that there's an absolute value in family unification, and that there's a value in retaining the best and brightest from around the world that get their education here. We were just talking about higher education. You look at the UC system and the number of foreign students that compete to get into our university for their undergraduate degrees and for their graduate degrees. And then if they can't immediately find an employer to sponsor them, we send them home. So we've invested our space and our resources in educating some of the brightest kids from around the world, but our immigration policy sends them home when many of them would like to participate in the economy here and help us grow new innovative ideas here in California. So the notion of making sure that we have a pathway for highly skilled folks to stay, even if they don't have an employer sponsor, is a really important consideration for California. And as I said, family unification, making sure that our policies actually allow for folks to unify their family here is very important.
Well,
and the way we wrote it, just to be clear about the expression of California concepts, was the definition of family was broadly inclusive, as was the president's proposal to also be inclusive of same-gender couples who weren't included in other iterations of immigration reform.
And maybe folks in Washington are listening to and watching us on the webcast today.
Highly unlikely, but we'll take it as
okay. So let me follow up on something related to something you just said. You filed a brief to U.S. Supreme Court on Prop 8,
Yep.
marriage equality. What are the issues for you?
What are the issues? Well, there are the issues in the brief, and then there are the issues for me.
Okay. Issues in the brief.
So the issues in the brief, and I filed it with 22 law school professors from around the country. And up to this point, all of the discussions around Prop 8 were only about the impact on same-gender couples and their ability to get married because of Prop 8's constitutional ban. What nobody had talked about was we also limited the ability of those people to petition their government for redress.
Interesting.
When you look at the First Amendment, people talk about the freedom of speech and the freedom of association and the freedom of religion, but one of the items in the First Amendment is the ability to petition your government for redress. Folks wanting marriage equality have no way to petition their state legislators to pass marriage equality laws. We've proven that we're willing to do it. It was passed before Prop 8 was ever voted on, didn't get a governor's signature, but the votes are clearly there for marriage equality in the state legislature of California, and I think the signature would be there as well. But we're precluded from doing it because of Prop 8. So Prop 8 also limited people's ability to petition their government, and then it limited us as legislators from legislating in the area. So it limited the ability of the legislature. And so we highlight these two issues in the amicus brief, and we go and we cite case law going back decades of areas where there have been cases on point with the question of what ability the general electorate has to limit the actions of the legislature. One of the more interesting cases, I think, is the ruling regarding the Rumford Fair Housing Act. So in California, we were ahead of the curve in terms of banning race-based discrimination in housing. There was the Unruh Act and there was the Rumford Act. And after they were passed, they were referendized. And the voters voted to invalidate them. And the courts ultimately said that these were fundamental rights and that you couldn't invalidate them in very simplistic terms, that you couldn't invalidate them through the initiative process. But there were a series of cases going back on this topic, and we hope that it's amongst the many things that the Supreme Court weighs as they're evaluating what they should do on Prop 8.
And that's Prop 8. Earlier you said, I think you said something like, I'm not a fan of the initiative process. I don't want to misquote you.
I'm sure I said something to that effect.
Along those lines. So is there a lot of talk within the legislature and outside the legislature about changing the initiative process? Do you think that that will happen, and what kinds of changes would you like to see in the initiative process?
When Bob Hertzberg was Speaker, he put together a blue ribbon panel to look at the initiative process. He didn't do a very good job of choosing the experts because he actually chose me to be one of them.
And me too, so, you know. I wasn't on the commission, but I did help.
But you remember, you tested a lot of the ideas.
That's right, yeah.
So we had things like doing a constitutional check ahead of time, because people are often frustrated that they vote for something and then the courts invalidate it. So one of the ideas was to have a panel of judges evaluate and give some sort of a statement about whether or not it would hold up to constitutional muster. Not popular at all. Having an indirect initiative process where people for a lower signature threshold could petition And if the legislature acted, then great, you didn't need to move forward. If the legislature failed to act, the question would go before the ballot. We looked at making a different threshold for signatures that were voluntarily gathered as opposed to those who were paid during a paid signature gathering effort, unconstitutional. So we went through a very exhaustive list of reforms and found that the most meaningful were either unconstitutional or unpopular. Some were even both. And so, as my colleagues in the Senate have said that they want to engage in this, I went back and I found the old report from when Hertzberg was Speaker and dusted it off. I think the ideas are as good now as they were then, but I also think they're as unpopular.
So probably
And any change to the initiative process has to be done by the initiative.
Yes, right.
So I am not.
Yeah.
I am not particularly hopeful that we'll see any meaningful change
Okay.
to the process. I think it is the most bastardized part of the progressive era reforms in California. I mean, let's be honest. The initiative process was created to create a check on the power of well-held special interests. And we've gotten to a point that only well-held special interests can qualify something for the initiative.
We're at a point where we want to ask some questions. We want to get some questions from the audience. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you, to date at least so far, what do you consider your greatest accomplishments as Speaker? And in this session, which will be your last session as Speaker and in the Assembly, what's on your wish list?
So look, the job of Speaker is actually several sets of jobs. So in terms of governing, I think the most important accomplishment is actually stabilizing the budget and working with two governors to get us from a point of $60 billion deficits to being, stable and to be in a place where we're actually improving the creditworthiness of the state. We took a slight hit in approval ratings in your most recent PPIC study compared to December.
Margin of error?
It really was. But actually, if you look at 2009 to now, we've seen a consistent increase. Yeah. Why? Because I think people think that we're actually serious about fixing the major problems of the state. And I think one of the greatest evidences of that is the fact that California is now creating more jobs than any other state in the country. Our unemployment rate is still too high. So my wish list is around this area, making sure that we're able to do some more significant work in job creation. Before my legislation, there was no statewide economic development model for the state of California. All of our economic development activity was happening at the local level. In most cases, cities competing with each other. In some cases, cities coming together through COGS to compete as a region, but never a statewide approach that actually looked at what we should be doing to grow jobs. And part of it was exacerbated by our tax policy and the fact that land use decisions are fiscalized. So that from a local government perspective, if you're looking at cobbling together a piece of land for economic development, you know that you get a 1% return on retail sales tax, so there's a revenue stream for you. You know that you get transient occupancy tax if you do a hotel, so there's revenue for you. But if you do biotech or nanotech or new manufacturing, you get nothing. And so the incentives for local government around economic development are not aligned with what our broad-based interests are to create the new jobs of the 21st century. And so a lot of what I want to do in this next 2 years is looking at that level of realignment. I think, for example, that we ought to give local governments a piece of the increase in income tax if they locate biotech or nanotech or other high-quality jobs. We're the natural home for them. But we don't give local governments any of the tools to attract them in a way that's meaningful. So what's happening in the peninsula is happening despite the fact that there are no good incentives. What's happening in Irvine around life sciences is happening despite the fact that there are no good incentives. We have to create some good incentives to move forward in this area. So I wrote legislation to create GoBiz, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. It's now moving forward. We also know that one of the reasons we were able to get through part of the recession was by increasing our trade and by increasing our international tourism. Domestic tourism went down, international tourism went up, and that's what helped our tourism industry survive. And so we wrote a bill last year to expand the operations of GoBiz to get involved in trade. And next month, the governor will go to China to open the first trade office that the state has had in 10 years.
10 years.
10 years, because the last ones did such a lousy job. They shouldn't have closed them. They should have restructured them. So the first one's in Shanghai. The second one will be in China as well. The third one, he's committed to me, will be in Mexico. These are huge trade opportunities for us, and we're uniquely situated in the Pacific Rim to take advantage of trade. So that's the highest part of my wish list, is working in this area, and I've written a bill this year to require GoBiz to come up with a biennial report and goal setting for what we do in economic development every other year, and create some accountability measures from the legislature so that this isn't a one-off, that this is something that exists well into the future. So that's on the legislative side. The other way you measure a speaker is whether or not they win elections.
Definitely. And you had some big wins.
Yeah, so in
The last
2010, I was the only Democratic legislative leader in the country to re-elect every incumbent and to grow my majority. Historically, in off-presidential years, the party of the president loses 5% of its seats in state legislatures. We should have lost 2 to 3. We actually picked up 1. It was a complete, we were the only one in the country to do that. And last year, you know, when everybody expected redistricting to hurt the Assembly as it benefited the Senate from a Democratic perspective, everybody thought we'd end up between 51 and 53 seats. We got to 55, with a magic number of 2/3 being 54. So that was important from just keeping score, but it's not important in terms of governing, as we said at the beginning. The way you govern is to make sure everybody's got a seat at the table, to make sure everybody's engaged in the process. It's why I put Republican chairs of certain committees, and why I've done rebalancing of committee membership so that it's in alignment with the membership, not in alignment with just a partisan imperative to get certain outcomes. So it is a tough time to lead a legislative body, but I'm pretty proud of what my colleagues and I have been able to do together.
Thank you. And my approval ratings are going to go down unless I get some questions from the audience. That'll show up in my evaluation forms later on. So let's take a few questions. And if there's time, I have a couple more questions for the speaker myself. Who's got a question? Here's
Right over
one.
here, I think there's one right over here.
And if we can keep the question short and in question format, please.
Mr. Speaker, hi, I'm Victoria Rome with NRDC. First of all, I want to thank you for this morning's announcement that you appointed Assemblymember Rendon to the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee. And my question is, just with regard to what you're talking about, economic development for the state, how do you see some of the new funding tools, the AB 32 revenues and Prop 39 that you mentioned, working with your goals of promoting economic development in local communities around the state?
So you mentioned AB 32. One of the elements of AB 32 was using market-based approaches to achieve the carbon offset standards that we were talking about. So last year I wrote AB 1532, which created a process by which you could use the auction revenues to do exactly what you're talking about. There are great opportunities for us to align our economic development with our environmental imperatives in the state. I was on the board of the California League of Conservation Voters for 12 years before I was in office. And I got involved because as a labor leader, I was frustrated with people always trying to create this false choice between jobs and the environment. And we found that there was a huge sweet spot. And so we've worked very hard to make sure that as we build the economy, we build it in a way that's as green as possible. Now, that's not popular with everybody, but it is popular with the people of the state of California. And if you want to check, the best way to look at it is to look at Prop 23, which looked to repeal AB 32. When Prop 23 was on the ballot in 2010, the votes to sustain the AB 32 standards, there were a greater number of votes for that than any other ballot measure or any other candidate anywhere in the country. So Californians are very clear in terms of what their environmental values are. We've been trying to be smart around how we do stewardship of manufactured goods. I wrote a bill that was derided in the Sacramento Bee's columns to recycle carpet, because when you look at landfills in California, a huge amount of our landfill waste is actually construction waste. And much of it can be diverted. And the easiest place to start was with carpet, and we put together a working group with manufacturers and found a way for manufacturers to join with us in doing the stewardship and recycling. Later got written up as the most significant environmental piece of legislation of the year. So we know that there are a lot of good things we can do in the area. We shouldn't limit ourselves just to talking about a renewable portfolio standard or some of the more popular items. Every single thing we do, we have to figure out how to do it in as environmentally a sound way as possible. But then we also have to make sure that we streamline regulations. There's a lot of discussion going on right now about CEQA. And so we've got to be mindful of not doing a single thing that undermines the environmental standards, but doing everything possible to expedite the review so that we get to the outcomes that we're going to get to in a more timely manner, because there is an an economic cost to delay. So good projects should get approved, bad projects should either be improved or rejected, but we should get to those decisions more quickly. Otherwise, we are going to lose in competition with other places where people could get answers more quickly.
Thank you for asking that question, and your answer, that was actually a question of mine later on. So another question out here? No, I don't see any other questions. Speaker, one other question I wanted to ask you. I'm not going to ask you what you're going to do next, because you're not going to tell us, and maybe you don't know.
I don't know.
But what are the qualities of what you might do next, given what your experiences have been the last few years, and just what your history are?
Look, I would love to stay in the legislature.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what I would love to do.
Yeah.
I'm just not allowed to do it under the law. And I've got to tell you, I think that's something we all really have to look at. Yeah. Term limits has been one of the most negative decisions that the voters ever made. It has hurt us as a state. And I understand the anti-elected official mindset that many people have. I don't think anybody could say things have gotten better for us as a state as a result of term limits. And I think the voters broadly get that, or else they wouldn't have voted for the 12-year in either house approach. But that's only a half-step fix, and it treats people like me and those who've served under the shorter term limits differently than it treats new people. So that's bad for the state. So any legislative opportunity would be one that's attractive to me. I don't see one that's readily available, and I may very well not run for another office for a while because there's nothing that's immediately out there. So I'd want to do something where I can still get engaged in public policy discussions, but I'd also want to do it in a way that I still get to interact with other folks that I enjoy. So the greatest enjoyment I get is dealing with students, whether they're K-12 students or university students. So I'd want to do something where I had some interaction with students as well.
This has just been fantastic having you here today, and this is a speaker with low energy. This speaker has high energy even when he has low energy, and really very, very thoughtful, and really appreciate it. Can everybody give a big hand to our
Thank you all.
Our speaker? And I want to thank the other members of our program today, Donna and Dean, and all of our funders, and all of you for coming out today. And please fill out the evaluation surveys, and thank you for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's just a pleasure.
I will not shake.
Yeah, I know, but we'll do this.